meeting. And just before we start, I'm going to have Frank Burton, if you would please read the notice to the public.
Yes, good evening. As sub-chair of the Workforce Development Subcommittee of the Law Enforcement Accountability Task Force, and in accordance with the passage HCR 85 adopting rules, a procedure for conducting virtual meetings of the General Assembly and its legislative committees during an emergency, this public body is authorized to meet virtually. Please note that there is no physical location to observe and to listen contemporaneously to this meeting in accordance with HCR 85. We are utilizing Zoom webinar for this virtual meeting. All members of the subcommittee have the ability to communicate contemporaneously on this platform. Should any subcommittee member experience technical difficulties, please call 302-519-4629. The public may listen and participate in this meeting by registering via the meeting link that is posted on the General Assembly's website. The public may also observe that this meeting through live stream is available on YouTube. A link to that live stream can be located on the General Assembly's website. Public comment is permitted at the close of the meeting. Public attendees in the Zoom webinar must utilize the raised hand function to be permitted to speak and shall be called in the order in which their hands were raised. Members of the public will be unmuted and given 2 minutes to speak. Public comments can also be submitted in advance of up to 24 hours after this meeting by emailing leotaskforce@delaware.gov. In the event that the public is unable to access the meeting will be adjourned and rescheduled. Please note that any votes that may be taken during this meeting shall be done by a roll call vote. So let's begin this evening's meeting by taking a roll call attendance of the subcommittee members. And I'm going to go ahead and ask our chair to go ahead and do the roll call.
Thank you so much. And I don't have the full roll roster in front of me. I would ask Mark if he could provide that, but as I see individuals here, and I would ask all of the members if they could please open their views there so we can see them. I know that RL is unable to, he's on the phone, and I'm not sure if Major Morty, Ms. Smithers, and also Mr. Parsons. Okay, there we go. Very good. All right. So, of course, Sharice Brewington Carr's here. Reverend Frank Burton.
Here.
Kaylin Richards.
Here.
Thank you, Kaylin. Paige Chapman.
Here.
Ann Farley.
Here.
Thank you. Brian Moore. Brian Moore. I see you. I think you're still muted, Brian. I see your mouth moving, but I can't hear you. There you go.
How about now?
Yes, I can hear you now. Thank
Here.
you. Very good. Keith Hunt.
Thank you.
Here.
Thank you. Sandra Smithers.
Here.
RL Hughes. Chief Hughes.
Here.
Thank you. Major Sean Marty.
Yes, ma'am. I'm here and I'll be on video in just a couple minutes.
Very good. No problem. And I do see we have Daryl Parsons is with us, who is the co-chair of the Law Enforcement Accountability Task Force. Hello there, Daryl.
Hello, Sharice. I'm working on video too.
All right. All right. Very good. I understand. As we're getting acclimated, I just would like to say thank you all for attending the meeting today. I'm not sure if we have any members of the public. We may have some persons indicated they had some schedule issues and would be coming on a little bit later. So I understand that. And I would like to say to you, and I would ask Mark Brainerd, Mark, do we have the PowerPoint?
Yes, ma'am, we do. I will share my screen momentarily.
If you would do that, please, that would be helpful. It's good to see all of you. Feels as if the whole world has changed since we last met.
Would Mark be able to also share that via email?
The PowerPoint, we did send that out. You want to have it
Okay,
again?
apologize. No, I can find it then. Thank you.
Okay, all right, no problem. We can send it out maybe again to you, Ann, right at the top of your screen. Mark, are you sharing yet?
How about if I can?
I do have my copy I started, and I know that some folks did as well, but I just want to make sure some things are missing from mine.
Sure. Are you able to, is everybody able to see?
Yes.
No.
I-
Oh,
I didn't-
are you sharing? Oh, there you go. Very good. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We can move to the next screen, please.
Mm-hmm.
I always like to start this and with a bit of a saying, and then we're going to move to our next item is just to kind of keep us focused in some things that are on my mind. Certainly, since we last met, we've had so many things that happen in our country, but certainly we did celebrate Martin Luther King Day, and some of the words that he says resonates with me and helps us, I think, in terms of looking at the direction of our work. And so I'll just share this with you. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. And my, haven't we not had that recently? And then human progress is neither automatic or inevitable. Every step towards the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle, the tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. And I consider all of you those individuals. Thank you so much. Next slide. So this is our agenda for today. We're going to very shortly have a moment of silence. We've done our introductions. We'll do our updates, look at a review in terms of information that we have or report outs and consider where we are. These are the two areas that we're going to be looking at moreover today. And then also looking at our what's next, primarily in terms of report development or recommendations or early recommendations in our listening session, which is not today, and we'll get back to that in the schedule of our next meeting. I'd like to have a motion to accept the agenda as amended.
So moved.
Thank you. May I have a second?
Second.
Thank you so much. All those in favor, please say aye or either thumbs up.
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you so much. That's the majority there. Thank you very, very much. All of you, I'm sure, have been conscious and aware that since we last met, actually January 6th, there was a horrible incident in our nation's capital that involved many people, legislators, law enforcement officials, local, federal, and state. Citizens, persons were killed and loss of life. And I just would like to, at this particular time, have a moment of silence for the victims of January 6th, the national Capitol demonstrations, and National Guard persons on duty, as well as individuals who were there as for their right in terms of protest. Can we just have a moment of silence, please? Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I'll just ask at this particular time if there's any comments or any thoughts that individuals had that they'd like to share regarding what we've witnessed and what we've observed as it relates to that incident, and as it compares to our work. Any particular thoughts anyone have that they'd like to share at this time?
Thank you, Sharice. I would like to share if I may.
Please go right ahead, Ann.
I think the incidents of January 6th were alarming, and how perilously close and fragile our democracy is and our way of government and protecting that. I do think the subsequent response by law enforcement and to protect the Capitol, ensure safe inauguration, express a lot of gratitude for law enforcement at all levels, federal, state, and local, for doing that. But henceforth, since a lot of the videos have come out, it shows some complicity with some law enforcement officers, not whole entities, but individuals. And I do think that that speaks to the core of our work in this committee around workforce development and training. That goes, to the basic substance and essence of how law enforcement interact with members of communities of all races and colors, but particularly marginalized communities and communities of color, and that we would be remiss if we did not include this in our report and address this issue.
Thank you so much, Ann, for your comments. Any other thoughts? Any other persons that would like to share any thoughts? Yes, Keith.
So yeah, the predominant thought for me, and I would say probably even the emotion, was just in observing the unfolding of that event, to witness the stark contrast of law enforcement in action dealing with a group of protesters slash mob of people slash insurrectionists, and how they, as law enforcement, were able to show empathy, even, I don't know, I wouldn't use the word compassion, but empathy and restraint is a word I would use. And so it was almost a living example of the capacity of law enforcement. And I know this is just an isolated incident, that a lot of dynamics are running underneath and through it, but I was just profoundly impacted as an observer to witness that, in contrast to how law enforcement was positioned and physically and emotionally to deal with people of color, Black Lives Matters in particular, in terms of their protests, and other groups in terms of protests. So come away in conclusion with our work in that there is capacity, there is capability amongst our law enforcement, as exampled by the Capitol Police Force and Metropolitan Police Force in Washington, D.C. The question then is, how do we look at what's the root cause difference in how that group responded, dealing with that population of people, which was a diverse group, by the way, but also was predominantly Caucasian group. But how do we begin to help weave that capacity and capability of law enforcement to show compassion, to show empathy, to show restraint as they deal with marginalized communities and people of color in the day-to-day work, as well as writ large any protestations that may occur from those communities. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, Sharice, real quickly, I too, like Ann and Keith, want to commend the Capitol Police Department for their efforts, especially Eugene Goodman. Just in the face of diversity, he acted on his prior military background to divert all the people who were coming in away from our lawmakers. So this just gives us an indication about that law enforcement code of ethics that we may talk about tonight too, about how it works when you do it right. So that's it.
I'd just like to say that as I watched what was unfolding in the nation's capital, what occurred to me is that there is no behavior that can be addressed or corrected if it's unacknowledged. And for the longest time, although marginalized communities have said that there was a difference in policing, none of that could have been acknowledged or would have been acknowledged until the difference was felt by the dominant society. And I thought it was very much like a parent who doesn't acknowledge a spoiled child until that child turns on them. And I think that's one of the things that we witnessed in this country for the first time. And so many people were appalled, but many communities of color were not surprised because it's the kind of thing that's been experienced for years, for decades, but has not been acknowledged. It's often been denied. But what we witnessed at that time was something that could not be denied. And this was like an awful mob turned on anyone who, regardless of color or anything else, who did not believe what they believed or stood in their way. And it was just, in some respects, it was very frightening to watch because it showed just how fragile our democracy really is. And because we didn't acknowledge the roots of the terrorism that existed, it was allowed to spread and really erupted into an awful situation in our capital, something that I don't think any of us expected to happen.
Thank you,
And
Ms. I'm sorry.
at the same time, we saw the terrible, seamy side of our society. We also saw some of the best when we looked at what the Capitol Police did.
Mhm. Thank you. Kaylin, were you trying to say something?
Yeah,
Go
I
right
just
ahead.
wanted to add that January 6th, it felt very inevitable to me. It almost felt like there were like moments that happened before that that was just kind of like building up to that moment. I didn't think it would happen in the scale that it did, but I felt like, something was going to happen.
Mhm.
But one thing that stood out to me as it relates to this subcommittee are the officers who were a part of the insurrection. So there were videos of Capitol Police officers who were letting in the protesters who had, Confederate flags, Nazi flags, you name it. And so it made me think, well, how do we vet our police force? Because after, those videos came out, the National Guard, they were vetting their people, Capitol Police, they were vetting their people. And I felt like it was something that should have been done well before January 6th.
Mhm.
So that was just something that really surprised me. And again, I was really disappointed by what happened. And I've been to the Capitol before, and I just couldn't even fathom how they got as close as they did to the Capitol.
Mhm. Mhm. Anyone else? Any thoughts? I will tell you that watching that I felt like I was in a third world country watching that behavior. Um, I'm concerned about, and I think it really, regrettably, when you look at the scope of the work that we're doing, when we talk about preparedness, readiness, exposure, um, reaction, because we know that there was, at least in terms of the injuries to the officers and to civilians, that post this incident, that there at least was one officer who committed suicide, and um, after, in direct correlation to this incident. And it just made me think about the coexistence in our society of both sides. Within most police entities, you'll have, and we've looked at that when we look at individuals who will follow guidelines, policies, and procedures, and those who will not. And when you talk about the vetting, Kaylin, to your point, it's something that not only you do on the front end, but how do you do that on an ongoing basis in a credible way to ensure safety for all? Do you know what you know, existing within that culture, that microcosm, if you will, of that culture, around what is taking place within that, and how much of a challenge it must be for members of law enforcement, as well as internally, coexisting within that bubble, so to speak, and trying to survive it, work through it, perform their duties, as well as community, having a concern, consciousness, suspicion, fear, um, um, lack of disregard or what have you as it relates to law enforcement watching that? How do you build confidence and trust and continue to support when you see, and as you say, an isolated incident happening such as that? I too, Kaylin, feel that there had been, that was almost kind of a bubble, an eruption, if you will, of things going on, whether it was through demonstrations that take place, um, civic and voter disenfranchisement, the race baiting, racial injustice, and those kinds of things that are happening on, is that there were just a lot of angry people. I've been in rioted situations before and what have you, and it appeared when you hear some of the individuals now stepping back, and of course, people are facing criminal charges, including members of the Delaware community as well. Is that it's as if they lost their minds. They didn't realize an aspect of all of what they were doing, or as it continued to evolve. And I wonder, all communities may very well be subject to that. Let us not forget that from Delaware. I'm not saying that all of the citizens that went from here, about 5 buses or so, as we understand it, organized, and maybe more that we are unaware of, that went to the Capitol and was involved. We know at least 2 individuals who have been involved in federal crime from the state of Delaware. And, that coexists in our community, and I'm sure in others as well. And our responses to that, and the level of readiness for our law enforcement, as well as for our community, to accept that as a reality, and also for us to have a response. So I'll stop there. Does anyone else have any thoughts about that yes, Keith, go right ahead.
I just want to make one small comment, and that is building on Kaylin and your comments regarding the vetting. As a subcommittee, I think that there are a few leverageable root cause things that we could do to try to institutionalize a difference, a change, and vetting in terms of our workforce development role and focus. Vetting, and what I know, police forces, local and national, have background checks, but we've all seen examples nationally how that obviously did not vet adequately some police in terms of the behaviors that we've seen. So as we proceed in our work, I would like for us to really pay close attention in terms of policies, procedures, practices around the vetting layered onto the background check. And then in addition to that, the ongoing training, unconscious bias training, et cetera, that complements that vetting, so that you sustain that mindset that you've now cleared on the front end, as we say, to sustain that mindset as these officers go about executing their duties. So I think we have some key leverage points here that we have an opportunity to really kind of address, in spite of maybe some of the union and or legislative things that we may not be able to unbundle as quickly as we may like to. There are things that I think we can influence. I'd like to build on Kaylin's comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any other persons have anything to say before we move on? Something may come to you as we regard. I just think that it continues to inform the dialogue, if you will. We cannot ignore that this has occurred, and we cannot not know that there are, whether it's domestic terrorism in our state, or cells of domestic terrorism in our state, or other crime, and et cetera, that we really doesn't elevate to the point of media notice or public consistent notice. And how do we address that? And what is it that law enforcement personnel are expected to address or be equipped for? Last thing I'll say about this is that it was clear to me that the law enforcement personnel, either from a at will disregard or non-support. I know that Mayor Bowser talked about some call for assistance. The local law enforcement talked about aspects of how they were asking for support, or did not, or what have you, but they were ill prepared to address that, and had knowledge prior to potentially and awareness. I just think in terms of the scope of our work is that one of our North Stars should be what can we do to ensure that individuals are as prepared as possible with all of these considerations in their work day to day, as well as in their interactions with the public. So to that end, let's move ahead with our work, and I'll ask one last time, and we'll just, as we go on, I don't know if any members of law enforcement personnel have any thoughts, or Ariel or Sean, or, and I see Daryl, you're on also as our co-chair. Any thoughts that you'd like to share, as well as the co-chair of the task force? But Sean or Ariel, any thoughts?
No, I think that certainly this group is paving the way forward on where we need to do. We've talked about continuing training across all fields, increasing that as Keith mentioned. So I think that we just need to keep moving forward and not forget the events that have happened, not only recently, but long term, right? To help guide us and pave the way for giving us direction on where we need to move forward.
Mhm. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Ariel, any thoughts?
Well, I would just echo everything that's been said. It was atrocious, it was horrific, and it is not what we should be standing for, any of us. And so that just makes our work all that much more important that we do it and we do it right.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Daryl, do we have you here? You still here? Yeah, there you go. Any thoughts?
No, I just want to echo the comments of others that the situation was tragic. And I'm happy we have started this work. And I'm really happy we have you and your co-chair to shepherd this committee. Thank you.
And the committee, you guys have been great, and contributions will continue, and we're going to get there. We're going to make, this is not a one and done. We're going to continue this work and make recommendations, and stay committed to doing the best we possibly can. So along with that, in terms of updates, I want to share with you, and Daryl, actually, I want you to stay right there for a minute, if you would be so kind to share with the group about the interim report that was provided to the public on the task force work overall.
Let me see if I can get this video up here.
Okay, there you go.
All right. Apologize, I am traveling right now, so you might have a little delay. I'm about 2,000 miles from you guys right now.
Be safe.
Yeah, if you saw me travel, I looked like a PPE salesman. I was so wrapped up. The interim report was shared. The goal of the interim report was to allow the public to see the progress that has been made, and for all of the committee members to understand, their role vis-a-vis what's happening in the other subcommittees. It is just that, I emphasize, an interim report. It is an interim report, and we want to emphasize that over and over and over again. These are not the recommendations which are going to be going to the General Assembly. This is not the final report, that, the task force thinks A, B.
Look as if he froze there a little bit. Daryl, do we have you? He may be having some connection issues, and I'll just pick up there, and if we get him back in, then that'll be great. The interim report, and to Daryl's point, he was sharing about.
On the committees.
Oh, there you go. You froze for a bit, so go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah, my internet connection here is probably a little different. So I'll be brief. But again, I want to thank you for all of your, help. And I think the interim report will give us guidance as we move through the spring and later through the year.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daryl. Thank you, and be safe and again in your travels. Has everyone seen the interim report? It has been sent. We'll send it again to make sure that it's like, I'm sure all of you get a lot of information, but to make sure that you see it. Our section and what we contributed, knowing that we have not gotten to the point of recommendation yet at this point, is that we laid out specifically the aspect of our work and how we've begun to approach it. The fact that we had the task areas that we were looking at, our 4 key task areas, and the elements of which we were looking at, and some of the early impressions. Very, very significant in terms of the feedback that we got in the last meeting after our first looking at recruitment, retention, development, and those training, looking at those kinds of entities and what have you. So please look at that. And as Daryl said, it is not the final, it's the interim. We have not made recommendations. Some of the other committees have done so, but these were our impressions that I took away from primarily the feedback that you all have given, the data that we've looked at thus far, and et cetera. And so please go back and look at that. And then also look, in some instances, we found that some of the committees are having some of the same thoughts that we have. We are working together, particularly with transparency, community policing, and what have you. And as a result, we may have some of the same ideals going forward. So for today, in terms of the task reviews that we had planned to look at, we were looking at police incidents of physical engagement and violence. I don't know that we have content yet, feedback directly about what that is. I know that there's a task force looking at it, a committee looking at it specifically, but we were hoping to contrive that from the data that was provided to all of you. And are any persons on within the meeting today that was looking at that very specifically, that is willing to report out or have any impressions about what you saw in the data that was provided? Any persons? Maybe we'll ask our law enforcement folks if you have any feedback that you'd like to provide about incidents of physical engagement and violence. That's Sean and RL.
I can't provide any specific data right this second, but certainly I think as we wait for the other committees to have that information, we can certainly look at it. I will tell you that we do track that information in the Delaware Justice Information System, DELJIS, the reporting mechanism, and then also internally we track that through a series of mechanisms that we use for all response to resistance incidents. That are categorized part. That's also part of the accreditation process, which Chief Hughes mentioned during our last meeting. So that's included, and is so certainly that data. There's data that is available. I would just I wouldn't want to sidestep the proper method for obtaining that information, and unless you ask me to do something specific, I can certainly aid in any way I can.
Okay, very good. And I will be. Will be definitely. And I knew that we do keep the data in and of itself and look at it, because again, part of our responsibility as a committee is to tell the Delaware story, what actually is taking place in the scope of Delaware. That was the purpose of having that, not to, again, cross-pollinate to some degree purposefully any other committee that's looking at that, but to get a snapshot or an idea of what actually is happening in the state. So Sean, yes, I'm definitely going to ask you to help with that. RL, do you have any contribution towards that? Any thoughts?
I would direct folks to take a look at the University of Delaware's website and how they share information. It's what I use. It's where I'm trying to go with our agency. So I think they're doing a really, really good job. So that, and to Sean's point, the data is being collected. We need to do a better job of getting it out there so people can see it. And so that's something that I know I am working on, and I know some other chiefs are as well. But I would ask folks to just take a look at the University of Delaware's police department's website. They have a very robust.
So what I'm going to ask you, RL, you and Sean, and are there any other persons that are there today that would like to have a look-see at that and begin to pull that data, or at least pull what we have to work on that? Frank, can you also work with Sean and with RL as well, to kind of make sure that we have a report out next time, or at least a snapshot of what's taking place in the state? We'd appreciate that. That was the intent of looking at that, what kind, and you have the parameters specifically of what we're looking for. That would be really, really great. Thank you so much. Funding and capacity. I will tell you that I do have and we'll have more definitive feedback when we meet again, or in the interim, I may provide information to you. Sources that this will come from will be from the governor's office. It will also be from the Criminal Justice Council. And we may also look at some foundational grants as well. I know USDOL, Department of Justice, provides resources here to the state and what have you, so that we get a better sense about what is being expended on law enforcement in the state of Delaware, at least for some resources that are coming in. And we'll also begin to look at some of the local budgets and put that together, so we have some sense about what is the dollar figure that's kind of spent on what. as well as considerations for what is happening in community as well. We have law enforcement in and of itself, but we also have support groups that are and entities and nonprofits and for profits and what have you that are also contributing in some ways to either crime prevention, and things of that nature as well. Providing services, reentry, all of that, but just specifically looking at anything that could be labeled around law enforcement, prevention, and response. We'll do that. Make sure you have it. So with that, now I'm going to turn this over to my co-chair, to Frank, to begin to lay out where we are as it relates to general operating policies, procedures, and code of conduct guidelines from the reporting that we have thus far, or look at where we need to go next with that particular work to make sure that we have that. Frank?
Yeah, in terms of the things that we just talked about and what Sharice just mentioned, and I really want to probably zoom in on this code of conduct because we kind of talked about it with the insurrection. All sworn police officers must abide by a law enforcement code of conduct. Now, I don't know who was tasked to take a look at that. I wanted to know if anybody wanted to speak specifically about some of those things in the law enforcement code of conduct and just kind of to level them up of what happened on January 6th. If we don't have that, I can read it, but anybody want to speak about that?
Keith, I think you're
Keith,
saying
you're
something,
muted.
but
It
it's
looks like
you're on
yeah,
mute.
you're muted.
Okay, there you go. You're still muted.
No,
Okay, there you go.
I got a call. I was just trying to get rid of the caller.
Oh, okay. I'm
Okay,
sorry. I'm
okay.
sorry.
We
Okay,
saw
no
your mouth.
problem.
We saw your mouth move. We thought you were speaking.
Yeah, no problem.
Anybody else want to speak about that law enforcement code of ethics, code of ethics?
And we did provide, a number of you said that you wanted to work on general policy, those kind of things. May not be individuals that are on the meeting for today, but obviously if we don't have that content.
Yeah, let me just read it and see if we can have some discussion around it. So the law enforcement code of ethics says, as a law enforcement officer, my fundamental duty is to serve the community, to safeguard lives and property, to protect the innocent against deception, the weak against oppression or intimidation, and the peaceful against violence or disorder, and to respect the constitutional rights of all liberty, equality, and justice. I will keep my private life unsullied as an example and will behave in a manner that does not discredit me or my agency. I will maintain courageous calm in the face of danger, scorn, or ridicule, develop self-restraint, and be constantly mindful of the welfare of others. Honest in thought and deed, both in my personal and official life, I will be exemplary in obeying the law and the regulations of my department. Whatever I see, hear in a confidential nature or that is confided in me in my official capacity will be kept ever secret unless revelation is necessary in the performance of my duty. I will never officiously or permit personal feelings, prejudice, political beliefs, aspirations, animosities, or friendships to influence my decisions. With no compromise for crime or with relentless prosecution of criminals, I will enforce the law courteously and appropriately without fear or favor, malice or ill will, never employing unnecessary force or violence, and never accepting gratitude. I recognize the badge as my office as a symbol of public faith, and I accept it as public trust to be held as long as I am true to the ethics of police service. I will never engage in acts of corruption or bribery, nor will I condone acts by other police officers. I will cooperate with and legally authorized agencies and their representatives in the pursuit of justice. I know that I am alone and responsible for my own standard of professional performance and will take every reasonable opportunity to enhance and improve my level of knowledge and competence. I will constantly strive to achieve these objectives and ideals, dedicating myself before God to my chosen profession, which is law enforcement. Anybody have any reflections on those law enforcement code of ethics?
I have a question, Frank. Where exactly are you reading that from? What's the source?
It comes from most police officers' code of ethics. You can look on any police officer's website. This particular one comes from um, the Greensboro Police Department in North Carolina. But
Okay.
mostly all police officers go by this code of ethics.
What do we have here in Delaware? Sean, I see you open there.
So I think the pastor is 100% correct, right? There's a code of ethics. I can tell you that we, in our academy, teach for every officer that's coming through there, not just DSP, as I've mentioned several times in our groups, but multiple agencies and recruits that have gone through for years and continue to go, that the core of anything and the foundation is going to be our ethics and our core values. It has to be. It's the bedrock for everything to build upon that. And it's uncompromising. I mean, if we do have something that violates one of those core values or those code of ethics, then there needs to be consequences. But also there has to be a fair and equitable process to go through that to make sure that it is. And if there is an infraction, again, there's punitive action, sanctions that are taken for violations of that. So I think we need I think it's very applicable to look at that is the most important thing that any law enforcement officer, or anybody who's taken an oath for that matter of serving the public, needs to abide by. The certain code of ethics, both on and off duty, it's something that we value. And it's not like you can take off the badge when you're off duty. I mean, it is part of you. So I think that it's a very well made point. We need to stick with those code of ethics, those core values. I mean, they're ingrained in every single recruit has them on their person. They need to memorize those. They're large letters in our academy walls, and every training advisor counselor, aka drill instructor, imparts with them there. And every single person that enters the academy over their years of service for in-service or elective training goes over those. So it's absolutely something critical, something we should never forget, and we need to, Mr. Hunt's point is to continually drive those points home of what they mean so that they're not forgotten above that. So definitely think it's part of the workforce development. It needs to stay on task. It needs to be part of everything we've been talking about. And it simply just cannot be violated. So to Chief Hughes' point a few minutes ago, the bad thing is that when we have some few or many that violate that trust, it impacts all law enforcement, including the ones who value those code of ethics and practice that every single day. So we need to work to focus better that the entire populace that is entrusted performs what they should. So just my thoughts.
So can I ask I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Sharice. Go ahead.
And I was going to ask a question, and I thank you, Frank, for sharing that. I guess one of the things that's on my mind is what do we say? I hear that's a tenor or maybe a best practice, but what do we do in Delaware? And I was going to ask Mark if you could pull up that slide, go to the slide that talks about code of conduct, general policies and procedures and what have you, just in terms so we can look at the scope of the kind of things that we're kind of looking at. And while we're looking at that, in essence, is that ultimately where we are in Delaware? I heard you say that, Sean.
Yeah.
But is that where we are in terms of expectation? What is an actual, code? What is said, when you raise your hand and you swear to abide by the law and throughout, and how do we enforce that and things of that nature? And someone else was beginning to say something before Keith, yes, go right ahead.
So I just want to build on Major Sean's comment. And as Reverend Burton was reading that example, it just provoked me to think about culture and how you manifest a culture, and language becomes a very important part of that, and the code of ethics becomes the language by which we kind of lay out some guidelines, some mental mindset. The problem comes in that typically that language is used as a part of the stick, meaning that if somebody steps outside of the code, then we can say, well, you were introduced to the code of conduct, you recited, you signed the code of conduct, and therefore we're going to discipline you based on the code of conduct, as opposed to conversely, that mantra being part of a ingrained, I don't know, brainwash is the wrong word, ingrained mindset. And I heard Sean mention that it's for Delaware, it's posted everywhere. They have it in their wallets, etc. But the question I have is, do they really have it in their minds? And how do we, as part of a planned intervention to make it part of the culture and part of the consistency in the mindset, have this mantra recited? Now, as Reverend Burton was going through it, I said, wow, you know, I've not been in the police culture and organizational, so I don't know. Do we have folks at the start of the shift recite these codes of conduct before they hit the street? And on a daily basis or monthly basis, I don't know. But those are the kinds of things that would help one always have this code in their mindset on an ongoing daily basis, because it is the day-to-day is where the rubber meets the road in terms of what person's bias comes into play, anger, frustration over what happened last night or over the weekend at the house, and then they do something untoward, and then we pull out the code of conduct to say, hey, you're held accountable to it. I would rather us, not rather, because I don't know, I would like for us to inspect in our policies, procedures, practices, how we're ingraining the code of conduct and acculturating the code of conduct on an ongoing, consistent kind of basis. And the last thing I'll ask and say about this is, as Delaware, as we started out this journey, is there the ability to have one code of conduct for all law enforcement agencies within and across the state, as opposed to multiple codes of conduct that multiple agencies may have? I don't know how that works.
Understood. Thank you for your comments.
Real quick, Major, I see you have something. I just want to say this. Thank you for chiming in. And I'll say this, even in federal law enforcement, our code of ethics, while the words are not specifically like stated here, but the spirit of law is still the same. To answer you kind of sort of, Keith, and I'll let Major tell you a little bit more, and RL can chime in as well. One of the things, there is a code of ethics, but there is also a code of conduct. There are two different things that are there. But with this code of ethics, even when I started reading, in just the first couple of sentences, you saw all that stuff down in January 6th in DC, kind of like just go fly the coop. One of the things that you and Kaylin mentioned, and part of your answer here is that no, law enforcement doesn't read that every day before they go out. Once you get it, you're supposed to have it. But I tell you this is what I'll tell you from a federal standpoint, as well as a state standpoint, and even what we saw down in DC, is officers know who the bad officers are, right? So part of it is, you can come in, we can do the code of conduct and we can train all we want to, but it's going to take the ownership and the accountability of the officers and commanders to say, listen, this guy may have a problem. We may need to talk to this guy or whatever before it gets to what we saw in DC. And that's just an ownership and accountability on a standpoint of fellow officers as well as commanders to be able to do that.
So question for you. I'm sorry, I know Sean wanted something too, but I have a question. Just in
Yes.
general, put it out there for us to think about. So when we talk about this in the scope of what went awry in DC or the potential here, and how do you indoctrinate and sleep, eat, and breathe culture, and developing on the way to developing a culture and the support of a culture, ultimately, are we talking about the Police Bill of Rights? Are we talking about a universal code? What exactly are we potentially talking about that we need to perhaps take a look at to say, what's the expectation here? And it kind of gives a segue to a degree of looking at our training units. And this is something we're going to learn a lot more about next week in the listening session, but I'll just introduce it now in part so we can begin to put this in our thought processes. We all know currently that COPT is like a universal training, is the largest training entity in the state, operated by the state police. Um, what we're going to look at in terms of the listening session next week is that we have some national, regional, and local experts to kind of talk to us a bit about just this workforce development listening session, to talk to us a bit about, first and foremost, what is COPT in Delaware? How is it operating in Delaware? Also looking at the national models in and of itself, 21st century policing reports and some recommendations they've been making and what have you around workforce development, as well as looking at some regional aspects of specifically what's happening that might be considered best practices. When you heard Frank talk about what's going on in Greensboro and some of these other things that we know about, and for us to kind of digest that, I'm going to ask all of you to please, because it's our workforce development listening session, to please attend and listen in on that to help inform us and then ultimately come back to just talk about that. I've asked RL, Frank and I've asked RL to serve as moderator for that. We think it's important to have a local perspective. RL has had the opportunity to be, I think, the executive director at one point of COPT. And I will tell you also, for all full transparency, there is also a movement afoot. I know that the Transparency Committee is interested in looking at COPT. We, of course, have to look at COPT and any other aspects of training that we want to look at in the state. But there's a movement afoot to say, let's make some changes there. We're not ready yet to make that recommendation, because I think what we want to do is to continue down the path that we have, just do our fact finding, learn, and then move to a point of being able to make informed, intelligent, and appropriate recommendations that might fit what Delaware needs, and perhaps maybe on the way to a gold standard. So I'm going to ask RL, and I see Kaylin had her thing open there to say something, but I just want RL to talk a bit about the shaping of what that panel will look like next week. And then Kaylin, I want to hear from you, and Frank, you can continue with the dialogue.
I think Sean had something to say too.
Did you, Sean? Okay. So who's first? Okay, so
Thank you, Kaylin.
Okay, go ahead.
I will turn it over to Chief Hughes, and I can certainly then jump in. I think there's a lot of things to talk about, and I would be glad to share, but I don't want to step on anybody's toe or step out of my lane. So I'll defer to Chief Hughes, and
we're all driving down the same lane together, Sean. It's okay.
So, well, I will say this. I have a great deal of experience with council and police training as the former administrator of the COPT when I was served as director of training for state police. So I can address any questions that you may have in that regard. And then in terms, but I will just say this real quick. So for uniformity, all the officers are, when they swear an oath, okay, the oath is really kind of what the pastor went over, right? So that code of ethics is present in most epilogue language, or even up at the front of codes of conduct, as was properly differentiated. I think he's 100% correct on that as well. But the oath that you're swearing to clearly lays that out. In terms of the culture, 100%, and everybody's been saying about that too. I think that goes to every policy, but getting back to my earlier remarks, even more than every other policy that's there, that needs to be internalized within every single officer as part of their daily life and how they act. And it's right. We don't need necessarily to refer back just to create a policy when somebody does something wrong. Policies are guided to shape and form how people behave in any organization, but especially when we're dealing with public service and law enforcement, to put the parameters out there to guide us in what we should be doing every single day. And I think that we need to continue to focus on providing this parameter, providing that direction. I don't necessarily think that bringing out that code of ethics and going over that verbally every single day is necessary. Personally, I don't think that's the case. There are a lot of things that go over during shift briefing and so forth, but I can say that at least with DSP, that this is highly gone over through everything we do. From our training, it's always centralized. And I was teaching a course this afternoon for certified instructors under the Council on Police Training. I just came from Dover PD or Troop 3 rather, with that, and multiple of agencies. And that's one of the core of my discussion points in teaching them, is to focus on the bedrock, as I just said, and moving forward. And I'm not the only, I mean, there's multiple instructors that do that. Not to say it's perfect by far. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think, again, this committee has great ideas, and I think we're moving in the right direction here on trying to come up with a better idea on how we do that. But with that being said, I'll turn that over to the chief unless anybody has any questions for me. I'd be glad to answer.
And Sean, I just want to say, I didn't realize that you also had been executive director as well. So we're going to consider you as a subject matter expert to help us too, as we're trying to understand about the council on police training as well. So RL, any thoughts? Can you share again will you share for folks who's coming next week?
Okay, but okay. Before I do that, though, Sharice, I do apologize for my video not working right now. But I want to talk a little bit about this culture, and I heard the words indoctrination and some other things. What we want is a culture, and we want. So oftentimes, what happens is the difference between our espoused values, what we say we do, and then what we really do. In the middle there, the delta might be actually the culture. So we want what we say we do to be the same as what we do. And so how do you go about doing that? And there's multiple ways of doing that, but it's through a socialization process and internalizing. Sean mentioned about internalizing, and I think you even mentioned about institutionalized some of these things. So how do we go about doing that? And to Mr. Hunt's point around training and how we do that constantly and consistently during the training, those are all the right answers. And those are things we have to do. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there, because I'm not so sure just reading something is sinking in. We want it to be internalized. It is so what you want is, you want the officer, when you ask the officer, hey, why did you do that? Because that's what we do. That's what it is. That's the answer that we want back. Hopefully they did the right thing. He said, why'd you do that? Because that's what we do. This is my code. This is our culture. So how do we get there? And I think that this workforce development group.
I'm sorry, I want to ask you, just think about it, everybody. How do you get there, whether it's Delaware State Police or whether it's Bridgeville Police? Because there's a various, that's what we're dealing with in part across the state, is that police response in Bridgeville, it's fresh on my mind because I was in Bridgeville this morning for work. But what it means in terms of community policing or law enforcement in Bridgeville, Dagsboro, Greenwood, Millsboro, wherever, and what it means to statewide police or those kinds of things. What does it mean if you have a domestic terrorism cell in Lower Delaware or anywhere else in the state, and you're trying to address that, and you're faced with imminent danger or whatever you're faced with, and you're dealing with culture and complaints and concerns and those in capacity and all of those things. What does that mean in terms of being able to build that so that we have level up, if you will, or neutralize expectations for law enforcement across the state? We don't have those answers today, but just a thought in general. And I know Kaylin was trying to say something, and Frank, you can go back. Kaylin?
I just wanted to just add that I am a part of this work group, and I met with Representative Briggs King. She's also part of this work group, and we met yesterday, and we had a really good discussion about some general operating policies and procedures. We didn't get a chance to look at, well, I know I didn't get a chance to look at the code of conduct or the code of ethics just yet, but instead we focused on the law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights, and a particular example of how just how policies failed. This young boy, his name was Anton Black. He was 19 years old. And I'll give you guys just some insight into what happened, but I have a little timeline here, bear with me. So in 2013, there was a Dover police officer by the name of Thomas Webster who was seen on camera kicking a Black man in the jaw while he was laying down, complying with his orders. And then in 2016, that officer, Thomas Webster, was not found guilty of assault. And instead, he was paid $230,000 over 6 years by Dover PD to quit. And this is all from, the media reports. So feel free, if you have like other information, feel free to check me on that. But this is what I read. And so in 2018, that same police officer, to go back. So he was paid $230,000 and he was no longer allowed to work within Dover. So he went on to work in Maryland for the Greensboro Police Department in 2018. And that is when we found out, after he was involved in the arrest and death of Anton Black. That's when we found out that this officer had 30 use of force complaints on his record. And Greensboro Police Department said that they were never turned over to them, and particularly because one, those records are private, but he was not found guilty. And so I wonder, like, what policy will address that? Like, what policy will fix that? Because my expectation would be that the superiors at Dover PD would have held him accountable and would have prevented him from working in that capacity, or at least making sure that other law enforcement agencies were aware of this officer's history and the fact that he may need additional training or support. So I just wanted to mention that and just throw the question out there, what policies will fix that?
Well, I wonder, as you're talking, Kaylin, that when you hear about those things, is it that is policy, or was it policy that wasn't enforced? And, was it policy that wasn't enforced? And then ultimately, is it a culture by which don't ask, don't tell? Or is a culture by which an understanding is, this individual needs to be able to go to work? We know that Delaware has worked about this universal no hire list. I think, to your point, if I leave Delaware and I go across the line to Maryland or wherever I go, it doesn't mean that there's not an issue. It doesn't mean that there's not an issue even in this state, or ultimately that officer is at risk to commit crime again or something of that nature, or to reoffend, if you will, or continue with that behavior someplace else. But how, I think your question is that how did it get to the point of a catastrophe, so to speak? How did it continue to evolve? That to me is at essence when we talk about culture, because there's no way, no how that it should have had the opportunity, from my mind, to grow a record like that. Ultimately, how do you do that? How do you support that? And how does that happen? And I'm not asking us to examine all the aspects of the case because we don't have them in front of us. But thank you for sharing that with us. In general, just looking at that and any hypothetical aspect of it, what is one and done? How do you do that? Even if you're not found guilty per se in a court of law, doesn't mean that there's not other kinds of issues or a relative issue that should not be addressed to ensure that that doesn't continue to happen. And we've seen that nationally, whether it's a civil issue or etc. When is enough enough, and when do you decide, maybe you should be considering doing something else, even though it didn't meet the threshold, if you will, for an actual criminal act and those things. That's all culture to me, and it's also enforcement of policy, if it exists or not. Yes,
And
Keith?
let me just say this, and I don't mean to be in the way of the flow here, but
No, go ahead.
it brings to mind what you're saying. It brings to mind the young man, the young boy, Tamir Rice in Cleveland, and the police officer situation there. So what Kaylin is pointing out seems to be more the systemic nature of what happens, as opposed to the opposite of that being the systemic nature of what happens. Mm-hmm. So how do we inject change within Delaware so that is not the systemic nature of what happens in Delaware? We can't control the world, but we can't control Delaware. So
yeah,
how do we inject ourselves there so that we have the prevention piece, or the discontinuity cut off, so that a person doesn't go to another police force, no matter where it is, within the rules of engagement in Delaware? Because right now, what she just described and what we witness across the country is that protection and is more systemic among police culture than not.
I think,
and Ms.
I'm
Smithers,
sorry.
one second. I have a question. I just want to ask Keith, because Keith also, in his day job, as part of this, is diversity inclusion officer for the state of Delaware. And so in that role, Keith, what I want to ask is that, that's for every state agency, as I understand it, correct? And in doing so, you know, just some feedback. You don't have to give specifics right now. I know you're in the process of looking at a whole state plan for what we do and agencies and things of that nature. But, how do we ensure, when you talk about inclusion, diversity, culture, those kinds of things, and you're right, looking at the systemic paradigm of what we want to set the tone and have it be in Delaware, are there aspects of your work that would lend itself to what we're talking about as an overarching, if it was a, beyond just an executive order or whatever, what exactly is a framework that we should be working from or consider?
So yeah, and I won't take very long to address the opportunity. And I'll start with this, is that they're often, in terms of discrimination training or diversity training, the metaphor of the iceberg, in that what you see above the surface is just the superficial stuff. Is what's below the surface that really is what counts. Okay, the root elements of it. And so when I look at this role, I have been challenged to really kind of represent a lot of superficial things. I think one of the chiefs responded in terms of our values espoused versus our values lived. And so when you think about it, and as I was listening to Major Sean, it made me think about this, that he as a commander and all the chiefs as commanders, I absolutely positively feel and believe that they hold these codes of conduct to heart, and that they would like to feel that their troops hold these conducts to heart. What happens though in organizations, whether it's the police force or Amazon or whatever company it may be, I've always found, and Procter & Gamble, places I've been, that it's the middle management that holds sway, and that the senior executives have a vision and set of values that they would like to see everybody adhere to. Employees, they see how their peers work, and they're not in a position to hold them accountable. So they don't have the power to do that. It's the middle managers. So in the police department, it's the sergeants, it's the lieutenants, and such that hold that power. And so transferring what I'm trying to describe into the state, the intervention for me that's leverageable is there's a couple things. We have an upcoming design on a listening session around systemic racism. And what I'm trying to do with that is use that as a door opener, meaning that George Floyd put that on the table, but now as a state, we need to use that as a door opener to get that conversation and that acknowledgement at a baseline understanding and acceptance, as an acceptance that it exists, and that the consequences of it are real. Now, once we do that as a door opener, then we're following through with that with climate survey. The climate survey will also serve to widen that door in terms of drawing a baseline around where the workplace environment climates are as seen by the employees. Now, I could leapfrog all of that and coming in out of based on experience and just say to the state, the place where we have the most yield is in leadership development and training, and a new paradigm around what it means to be a manager and supervisor in state government. We promote people who are subject matter experts to now lead other people, and they have no clue or emotional intelligence around what that means and what that looks like. We have guidelines, we have policies, we have procedures, but those managers and supervisors allow those guidelines and procedures to be overlooked or overstepped. And so therefore we have incidences that occur amongst employees, and employees have learned to live with it. We cannot sustain ourselves as a culture attracting people and retaining people and having an inclusive environment as long as that persists. So the deeper dive then, the root is around really leveraging the high yield development and training and new paradigm for managers and supervisors, therefore putting a different accountability around their role and responsibility. Now, to further answer your question around, then so what we also do with that then is to now have a 360-degree performance process, whereas those employees that report to me, get to input on my performance review in a 360 kind of way and tell my leadership how good a job I'm doing, and stop being a boss and a supervisor to now being an enabler, a mentor, a coach, and a resource provider. Those behaviors is what I should be exhibiting, not being a boss telling people what to do and how to get it done, an enforcer. So now we have a balance of power now, whereas employees are able to understand that I work for them, they don't work for me. And so my role then is to enable them and to provide a workplace environment that is caring, that is nurturing, that is accountable for results and performance. Such that now we have, with that balance of power, we're able to now move much more forward as a harmonious group of supervisors, quote unquote, and managers working in harmony with employees as opposed to overloading them. I look at that balance of power being that what is missing in my just ignorant observation of policing is that balance of accountability. Anytime you have a George Floyd situation where the trainees feel kowtowed to their training manager to allow him to do what he did and watch that happen for not just 8 minutes, but the whole entirety of that episode without anybody intervening and speaking up, is the lack of balance of power from a boss subordinate standpoint. So what we need to have in state government is a balance of power such that we can have managers and supervisors be agents of change, agents of facilitation of culture consistency across that, making that part of their role and responsibility so that the environment is inclusive, welcoming, because they are consistently tending to and nurturing that. We have a ways to go to get there, but I'm telling you, the work is not difficult in terms of the strategic approach and a plan to make it happen. It's just time consuming for me to get alignment, buy-in, in such a way that I don't scare people to death along the way of affecting change. So that's where I see some of the parallels to what we have here is around that. And the middle management are the sergeants and the captains who are there to really kind of not overlord the patrol officers, but to invigorate them to institutionalize the codes of conduct on a day-to-day kind of a basis and hold them accountable for it.
Ms. Smithers, were you
I was,
trying to say something?
yes, I was just going to say that we also have to consider the intersection of policemen's professional lives and how they conduct themselves on the job and their personal lives. And we have a society that promotes certain attitudes. And it's very difficult for a human being to come out of that if they subscribe to those negative attitudes and walk into a policing situation and leave all of those things behind. And, you know, it's just a matter of humanity that we bring some of those things with us. We can be this stellar person on the job, but when confronted with a difficult situation, who we are, our lived experiences come out. And oftentimes those kinds of things are not acknowledged when developing the protocols for workforce development. You know, you're never going to be able to absolutely change attitudes as long as we don't acknowledge that people come out of those situations and they bring those with them.
Well,
And I
Sandra,
don't know how to address that.
Yeah, Sandra, let me just try to address that a little bit because what you say is absolutely correct. So, you know, there's a lot of money being spent in diversity and inclusion work, and this, I would include this as part of that in terms of training, unconscious bias training, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll say this, you can't buy your way or train your way out of this because of just what you said. People bring whatever baggage they learned in their household and their life with them. What we can do, though, is hold them accountable for their behavior on the job. I cannot reach out and pay enough to change the hearts and minds of people. What I can do is reach in and grab folks and hold them accountable for the code of conduct and or behaviors we expect of them on the jobs. So you can be whoever you want to be at home and in the community, but when you get on the job, that better line up with what we have as a code of conduct and an expectation. And again, the change agent, the person that leverages that, the roles that leverage that are managers and supervisors on a day in and day out basis. But they have to be brought to another level of understanding what the nature and focus of their role really should be. It's not to lord over, it's to facilitate that on a day in, day out basis, harmony amongst workers, focus on operations, inclusiveness, etc. And that should be the nature of their role and work. And that's what their reward system should be based on. And we don't have enough of that. And I'll tell you this, that as I've talked to consultants that have worked with us on the Ivy report, they say that what you're talking about, Keith, is a high yield item for all of our clients if we could get them to do that. And if you can get this done in Delaware, you will have stepped up a huge, mighty way to affecting change. And so I'm swinging for the fences with this notion here, because it is the I won't even say textbook, but it is the seminal approach to affecting long-lasting institutional change, is getting that role, managers and supervisors, to see themselves differently, to see themselves as enablers to make that happen. Simply because we cannot change the hearts and minds of everybody, but we sure can hold them accountable for their behavior on the job.
I agree. And I saw Brian, and I want to hear from Paige too, because she's been quiet. I haven't heard one word. Paige, you're not getting off the hook. We want to hear about what you're thinking. Just before Brian goes there, however, though, to your point, Ms. Smithers, Keith, and Sean, and everyone, you're right. How we show up in the world, our orientation, we just walk with that, and it takes us with us. And I like to think sometimes we have experiences in many instances where we're walking wounded. We haven't recovered from some things, and we just share that, and however it shows up in our world. And to your point, Keith, I'd like for us as a group to, when you talk about enabling, coaching, mentoring, and what have you, to move from unconscious, or be aware of unconscious, but address implicit. Because what Kaylin described is implicit behavior. It was enabled, it was supported, it was documented, recorded in a way that they should not continue to escalate or be mitigated or, tolerated, if you will, in any shape, form, or fashion. And looking at that and setting the tone or the culture for what that should look like in Delaware. So we've got a lot of work to do, but at least if we're thinking and talking about those kinds of things, whether it's in our training academies, whether it's our code, whether it's how our organizations are shaped and what's happening within them, then I'm on your team. I want to be swinging out to the fence also, but I think that's where we want to go. Brian, you had a thought?
I did, and the more I'm listening here, the more it's kind of bringing back some thoughts. I used to teach a course at our academy in Maryland called Customer Service and Law Enforcement, and it was something that was very much focused on the officer having a service-oriented mindset and kind of reminding us as we go on. But one of the things that we keep on hitting on, and I think a lot of people hit on, that the officers hit on, is we're talking about holding officers accountable. We're talking about, the code exists so that when you violate the code, we can address it. And one of the things that Baltimore County did, and I really enjoyed it, was, during roll call, occasionally the major or the colonel or someone would come in, and we would, an officer would be acknowledged for the service aspect of the job. Somebody did something positive. We recognize that. And, the reality is we go in, I can go into Target and I can look at, huge signs about how great the employees are and the positive focus on the workforce. And the fact is, a police officer is consistently, you're encountering people in the worst 15 minutes of their life. There is a consistent level of pressure of, feeling like you're targeted, of negativity. So, one of the focuses that those sergeants and those lieutenants and those captains have to be, and we can certainly help guide that, is reinforcing that positivity and reinforcing the fact that the code of ethics is a good thing, and highlight those individuals who followed it, who've exemplified it. it's hard when we spend a lot of time and the media spends a lot of time and literally the world spends a lot of time, because it's the world we live in, saying this officer did this, they violated this. Meanwhile, there are thousands of officers who have done fantastic things, who have helped people. And the focus reminding them that that's, RL has always, in the entire time that I've known him, reinforced that where the rubber meets the road is how we actually conduct ourselves. It's not what we talk about. He always says that intersection is how we actually do things, and reinforcing that, probably more important than other places, that we reinforce that when you do something right, we're going to acknowledge that too. Unlike Frank, I look at websites on occasion, and a lot of places you can find, I can go to websites for police departments, and it's very easy to find a place to complain about a police officer. Very few places that I can find a place where it says compliment a police officer. And, if you don't think the officers notice that, I can tell you the officers notice that. And maybe that's something that part of our work, especially when we're talking about recruitment and that mindset, is ingraining that professional mindset through positivity, and reinforce positivity when we recognize individuals that do the right thing, not just looking for the individuals that do the wrong thing.
Understood. Was there someone else? Oh, Paige. Oh, yes, we're not. Okay, Paige, what are you thinking? We've talked a lot. Paige has been hiding out. She's not hiding out over there. She's just intently listening. So I want to know what she's thinking.
I agree with all of the previous comments that have been made. I think in order to change the culture, though, we need to have a standardized practice and training through every department and every agency. Because as you mentioned before, you might get treated one way with DSP, and Bridgeville Police will handle the situation completely different. I think to change the culture of the state, you have to change every agency. And I think that starts really at recruitment and those in charge of recruiting, because if the recruiters are still looking for a particular type of officer that was the standard for policing back in 1959, that doesn't really work today in 2021. So I think to change the culture, we have to start with recruitment. And then from there, it carries on throughout the agencies and throughout the state.
Thank you. So Kaylin, you and Rue, I would like very much, just in general, because you all have started to look at some of these things and what have you. When we're looking at this slide here and talking about not only code of conduct, you see the items there is like, we know what's authorizing the structure. We have the detail around the union contracts, and we know certainly about the what's the ideal when we talk about the 21st century policing report and what have you, those kinds of things. Workplace culture in and of itself, and this is where we begin to ask about some of these demographics, is that what's going on, whether there are incidents or whether it's an extreme example like you're talking about, that example that you shared with us, or are there any other things that are kind of bubbling up or that are unreported, or things that we just don't know about that we need to find? Because Sean and RL and Frank are going to help us look about those incidents, but what does that look like, and where are they showing up? Are they showing up in a particular county, city, township? What's happening there that would help us? Are there code of conduct handbooks? Are there, Frank made the point. Ethics and conduct are two different things. Ethics informs conduct in some instances, but what is that? And what are the anti-discrimination policies in the event that is instances or issues around discrimination or things that come up in the kind of complaints that bubble up from within that culture that people are talking about, or in some instances are not talking about? In the example that you gave, Kaylin, it was clear that beyond the visibility, beyond the criminal charges that were dismissed or not founded, that there was a culture or an environment by which this individual was able to continue to exist. And
he
so,
was paid.
I'm sorry?
He was paid. He was paid
Exactly.
6 figures.
Exactly, in terms of a payout or those kinds of things and what have you that happened, that gives a different connotation to the behavior. So what example does that set for contemporaries or peers or what have you? But are we seeing those things in Delaware? Again, I keep reminding us that we are trying to tell a Delaware story, right, guys and ladies? That's what we're trying to tell. What's going on here in Delaware? You know, I want to hope that what Kaylin described and what we know, an aspect of that, that's the exception more so than it is the rule. But we don't know what we don't know, and we really need to do that work, or at least try to get at it, or continue to say if it doesn't exist, let's lift the lid off so we know what's going on, and what we can address and what we need to direct attention or suggest and make recommendations. Okay. Um, with that, Kaylin, was there anything else that you and Ruth, um, Frank, any other thoughts you all have about this section? We know we need to do some more work there, but any thoughts? I
I
think
just
go ahead.
I just like to say, wow, we engaged in a robust conversation about this law enforcement code of ethics, and it absolutely was necessary. And to Keith's point, Paige actually hit it out of the park with her firsthand experience. So I know she knows. So great job on everybody's part. I can't wait to hear from the public comment, see what happens.
Yeah, yeah. Just what the listening section is going to be great. And again, this I do believe, and I'm checking in with all of you all to see, are we moving in the right direction when we're looking at these issues and scratching the surface, and trying to find out this detail before we get to a point to make recommendations. Do we know enough yet? We know some things, and again, when you look at the interim report, it was about that scratch. It was about that first look in terms of impressions. Now, as we continue to do this work and look through it, I think it will help us as we're doing this learning journey, this listening session next week, and things of that nature, what you're going to continue to bring back in your research and your data, and reviews, that we'll be at a point to be able to make some relevant recommendations, some first recommendations, if you will, around what are some of the first steps and some of the things and considerations we need to make at this particular time. But you all tell me, do you think we're going in the right direction in our strategies? Do we need to do something different? Would you like to see something different? I know for me, one of the aspects is, and I task Keith with this, I know he's got a lot going on right now, but we need to hear from frontline staff. It never even more implicit, and relevant to me as it was after what happened last week. We don't want to hear from officers in the news or after an event. Like to be able to have them be a part of this work in some meaningful way, whether it's a focus group, whether it's something, so we get some feedback about their experiences. And it's various levels. It's the mid-management level, of course, but that front line as well in terms of the outputs, and experiences, lived experiences about what's going on. That I think will help us around having a better understanding of culture, real culture in our agencies as well. Any feedback, any thoughts about anything differently or anything that you would like? Are we going down the right path? It seems a lot, but are we unpacking this in a way that makes sense, or we need to course shift, or what?
One thing that I would like to see, Sharice, or at least have the opportunity to ask more questions to law enforcement officers. So maybe this subcommittee, we just have a Q&A amongst each others, or amongst each other, or external law enforcement officers. But sometimes I feel like I'm just like asking 21 questions, but law enforcement officers, they truly do have the information that, we don't necessarily have. They know the things that we don't know. So it would be really helpful if we were just able to like ask simple questions like, what recommendations would you recommend for Leabor or the code of conduct? And also I think the work groups are great. However, it's kind of, I don't know if this is anyone else, it could just be me and how I process information, but it seems kind of like spotty. Like one month we're focusing on this, then the next month we're focusing on that. And I just wonder if there's ever going to be a time where we can talk about, like we can have a conversation about what we all came up with, and then make recommendations, because I feel like I haven't had a decent opportunity to hear what the other groups have been finding, what they've been working on, or what recommendations they're considering. And I think that'll help inform our work too in this operating policies and procedures group.
I agree with you. What I would suggest you do, I don't know who that was, but what I would suggest you all do again is, I think that was the intent of that interim report, because we're all, I don't know now, I think there's a session going on today, for one of the other committees. and then we're all stretched doing various kinds of things. So look at that report, because that was the dump. So it was the first dump, so to speak, in terms of trying to do a mind meld about where everybody was in and of itself.
Well, I was talking about our work groups, like our work groups in the committee.
Yes, yes. Well,
Oh, okay.
well, let me clarify. They're not work groups, technically not work groups, but our tasks.
Task groups.
You're right. Yes. And the reason why, Kaylin, we've got like a whole 2 hours, and we're at 5:31 right now. So it's like if we did at each one of these areas, and this is why we tried. That was our strategy, Frank and I, to break them up so that we could talk about them versus talking about them all at one time. Because is there enough time to do it? But you're right. Yes, we're going to move that way, and that's part of our strategy to getting to recommendations. Absolutely, what your thoughts are, and etc. But we do think we need to get that feedback from officers, continue to do the work that you all are doing, because there's some unanswered questions and unanswered thoughts about how we pull that together before we start to make recommendations. But I know all of you have thoughts about where we need to go and recommendations. We just didn't want to get to a point that we started doing recommendations before we did our homework. And I appreciate that you all are doing this homework. I really, really do. Frank and I both appreciate that this homework is going on. So with that, I would like very much to, and I'll ask Mark if he would go back to our agenda on the slide. See where we are. There we go. So here we are. Next steps, to your point, Kaylin, is that, report development committee recommendations. The co-chairs have said to us, said to Frank and I, and to the other committees as well, is that while we're looking at and hoping to, the first interim report was to report back to the world as a public report, but also to report back to the General Assembly, which that was so, they're very concerned about, and other stakeholder groups, what work this task force is doing, the fact that it's important, but what progress are you making? Where are we? What's going on? To your point, Kaylin. So at the same time, they've asked us, please be as thorough as you can be. Make sure we get good content before you start to make recommendations. Is there any low-hanging fruit, so to speak, in terms of things that we can kind of catch on and things that we can do? I think we're kind of getting there. You all tell me. There's a lot always. I think we could probably research and look at this thing for years. But are we kind of getting and moving in that direction? And I do believe that after next week's session, which will be our listening session, and again, go back and reread or really do a deep dive into that interim report, we may be at a place to begin to flesh out some initial thoughts and recommendations. Okay. And that means feedback from all of you all to do that as well. So that's where I am. Frank, what are you thinking?
I think we pretty much covered it from what you talked about tonight, and just looking forward to, like you said, next week and having that conversation and see what happens.
Mm-hmm. So with that, RL, can you tell everyone who's going to be coming other than you, between you and Frank, in terms of what the setup is for the listening session next week?
Yes. So on the listening session next week, what I've done is we're going to have a little bit of an overview of the Council on Police Training, the legal piece to that, and the statute about it, and some of the rules and regulations that have been promulgated. But then we're going to have some folks. I have an invited guest that's going to come from the National Coalition of Legislative or State Legislatures. And so they can give us they've done an analysis on all 50 states around police training standards and standards and commissions, and just give us kind of a very quick overview of that on a national level. And then I've invited two panelists to come on board to talk. One is Mark Bakar, who is the executive director of the International Association of Directors of Law Enforcement Standards and Training. And so it's an international group. So it's all of the United States and around the world. So Mark has been in this business for a very long time, and he's agreed to come on board and to talk with us a bit about and share some of his thoughts on some of the best practices that are in this area of law enforcement standards and training. And then also I've asked Al Liebno, who is the executive director of the Maryland Post, which is a little different than, well, it's a lot different than what we have here in Delaware. And he's going to talk about his experiences with that, helping establish that. The website, I would also ask the folks here on our panel or on our group, go ahead and take a look at Maryland's post, the police officer standards and training. A very key important thing to as you go through that, you'll realize that they're also doing law enforcement police officer training and standards, but also doing corrections, correctional officials and PMP. So that, I think that's an important piece to also take a look at. So those two will be our panelists. We're going to have some discussion around, best practices, what's going on, how standards and training go ahead and as to Mr. Hunt's point about internalizing, institutionalizing, and of that culture and developing those things that we need to do, that systemic approach to combating things that we don't want. Actually, the systemic approach of developing the culture that we want to see, making sure that what we say is what we do. Also, through that discussion, I think it's going to be really important for folks to see that there is a lot of transparency around these standards and training commissions throughout the country. Well, some that are doing it better than others. There's a lot of transparency around the certification, decertification process, also the types of training that's going on. And again, to Mr. Hunt's point, Mr. Hunt is on point, I will say that, about the middle managers or those first line supervisors and that key role. A lot of the places are doing some very good training around that leadership development piece. And I will tell you, one of the places that we need to stand up as doing a great job and I'm not saying this to embarrass him, but Sean Moriarty and Colonel Zebley have done a wonderful job in the leadership development program that they put together and have been doing for about 14 years, I believe. It's phenomenal. We just got to get it out to everybody, to all of them. So to Mr. Hunt's point, that's an excellent point. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So that's going to be our discussion. And so hopefully we'll walk away with that with an idea of how we can build a system that systematically brings on and develops that culture and that training, that organizational learning, if you will, as we go forward here in Delaware.
I do think we do have another guest as well. Are we still on, Frank, for Mr. Thompson?
Yeah, I've invited J. Scott Thompson, who was the former police chief of Camden, who's a great friend and colleague of mine, and worked with him during that transition. His input was significant in the 21st Century Policing Report. I talked to him. He's supposed to come on as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I apologize. I had it right on here, read right over time. I didn't even read it, yeah. So I do apologize that. But I would like to, Frank, if I could have his contact information just to reach out and talk with him a little bit. I'd love to before Tuesday.
Absolutely, I will get it to you tonight.
Thank you very much.
I think thank you, Ariel, for that. I think that's going to be a robust conversation. And again, so we have national, we have best practices standards, we have regional input, and et cetera. When you talk about a 50-state analysis, can't get much better than that. I'd be interested to see what they said about Delaware. Maybe that might help direct some of what we're thinking or what we're finding as well. But I think that will help. I won't say dispel, but it will open the door, if you will, around what's happening currently versus perhaps potentially things we will want to consider and get back to a point. And back to you, Kaylin, as well, and others, is that in each one of these areas, and again, go back to the interim report and look at some of those impressions. They might very well be things, and this is from all of you and from the data and those kinds of things, but might be very well where we begin in terms of starting to develop some recommendations. We've got more work to do in and of itself, we do. But I do think that we can have something offered. And I think a goal is to have something offered in this legislative season, perhaps maybe that they could begin to work on, whatever that might be ultimately that we might decide or support coming out of this committee. But I think that the listening session next week is going to be very, very good. And then we'll get back in schedule for our work in February to be, let's start looking at some solutions. Some potential solutions and some additional feedback. Is that making sense to everybody?
Yeah, I think that's a good path.
Okay. All right. Very good. Very good. That's all I have. Our next meeting, next week, again, want everybody to please participate in the listening session. This is going to be key for you. It's going to be recorded. So if you just absolutely cannot, I know we changed the date, then ultimately, you can listen in, but we really would like for you to be able to listen in real time. I thank you, RL, for your work. Thank you, Frank, my co-chair, for your work in pulling this together. Ultimately, our next meeting after that will be February 23rd. We'll have work in between. And I ask you guys, I know it's a lot, but just in between here, you're going to hear from Frank and myself. Keith will be talking as well about, how we begin to set up a strategy to get officers' feedback and input. And any of you, I want you to feel free anytime you need to contact or reach out, send an email or whatever, that we do this in between meetings so that we don't have to do it all here. But we've had some robust discussions. Clearly, I often think, oh my goodness, how's the agenda going to go? And it's going to move court. We have a full 2-hour almost meeting, every meeting. So obviously we have a lot of content to go over. So I thank you all so much for your willingness to continue to participate, your commitment, and the work that you're doing. Do we have any public comment at this time? I'm not sure if we have anybody that signed up for public comment. Mark?
At this time, we do not have anybody who has signed up for public comment. If there is a member of the public who would like, they can utilize the raise hand feature. But at this moment, there is nobody who has signed up.
Okay, all right, very good. Well, if that, I would like to entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move to adjourn.
Thank you. Keith, you second, or you had something? Did you have something, Keith?
No, I just wanted, before you close, you indicated us getting together to talk about how we may do that. And what I'd like to do, though, is if we could also have Chief Hughes and Major Moriarty part of that, because one of the things that I'm conscious about is that we have to set a table in order to be able to do something like that. So we have no idea of like how the troopers out there view this work and or anticipate the nature and intent of this work. And so I like, and as well as when you do something like that, how does that get in the way of the flow of people's schedules, assignments, overtime? So I'd like to have them be part of that conversation so we can figure out how to shape that up and get some one-stop shopping on that, if we can.
Very good. Thank you
And
so
I'll
much.
be happy to meet and flex my schedule anyway to meet you guys' schedule.
Thank you so much. We'll do that. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. So we had a motion on the floor with Ann. Can we have a
Very
second?
quickly, real quick,
Yes.
before we do that, RL, Chief Hughes, I just emailed you that information, so you should have it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
All right. Ann made a motion. Can we have a second to adjourn?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Thank you all. You can have the
Aye.
rest of your evening back. Thank you so much. Take care.